There are stories that stay with us forever, stories of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend even death. This is one of those stories. It takes place in the quiet town of Willowbrook, where an old man named Henry Walker lived a simple yet meaningful life. He had no grand fortune, no sprawling estate, but he had something far greater, a loyal companion named Max. For years, Henry and Max were inseparable. They walked the same paths, watched the seasons change together, and found comfort in each other's presence. But life, as it always does, moved forward, and time showed no mercy. One autumn day, Henry was taken from this world, leaving behind a grieving town, an empty house, and a faithful dog who refused to accept that his best friend was gone. What happened next is a testament to love that never fades and loyalty that cannot be broken. Do you have a pet who means the world to you? Share your story in the comments below. Now, let's begin. The town of Willowbrook was small and quiet, nestled between rolling green hills and dense woodlands. At its heart lay the old cemetery, a place where generations of families had been laid to rest. The cemetery was a solemn space, surrounded by a rusted iron fence with vines weaving through its bars. Its stone paths covered in moss and fallen leaves. During the day, a few visitors would come and go, placing flowers on the graves of loved ones, whispering prayers into the wind. But by nightfall, it was deserted, except for one lonely soul who refused to leave. Curled up beside a freshly dug grave was Max, a golden retriever with a thick, golden coat now matted with dirt and damp from the evening mist. He had been there for days, his body shivering against the cold earth, his eyes filled with a sorrow too deep for words. No leash bound him there, no fence held him in place, only his heart, his undying loyalty to the man buried beneath the soil. Max had once belonged to Henry Walker, an elderly man who had lived on the edge of town in a small wooden house with a garden that always smelled of lavender and rosemary. Henry was a quiet, kind-hearted man who had lived alone for years, finding his greatest joy in tending to his plants and reading books on his front porch with Max curled up at his feet. Their story had begun many years ago when Henry first found Max as a puppy. It had been a stormy autumn evening, the rain coming down in relentless sheets, turning the streets into rivers of mud. Henry had been on his way home from the market when he heard a faint whimper coming from beneath an old wooden bridge. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but something in his heart told him to stop. He crouched down, peering into the darkness, and there, huddled against the cold stone wall, was a tiny, shivering puppy. "Well, now," Henry had murmured, setting down his grocery bag and extending a gentle hand. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The puppy flinched at first, but as Henry spoke to him in a soft, reassuring voice, he slowly inched forward, his wet fur sticking to his frail body. Henry scooped him up, tucking him inside his coat. The little creature trembled against his chest, too weak to resist. That night, Henry dried him off, fed him a small bowl of milk, and wrapped him in an old wool blanket. He hadn't planned on keeping him. He told himself that he would find the puppy a proper home. But by the next morning, as the tiny creature nestled against his side, sighing in contentment, Henry knew the truth. The dog had found his home. From that day forward, Max never left Henry's side. They became a familiar sight in Willowbrook, Henry with his slow, measured steps and Max trotting happily beside him. They took long walks through the fields in the mornings, watched the sunset from the porch in the evenings, and on colder nights, Max curled up beside Henry's bed, his steady breathing a comfort in the darkness. But time had a way of taking things. Henry's steps grew slower, his once strong hands trembled when he held his tea, and his breath came in shorter gasps when he walked. Max, sensing the change, never strayed far. He would press his warm body against Henry's legs, as if lending him strength, as if trying to keep the weight of time at bay. Then, one autumn afternoon, as they walked their usual path near the golden fields, Henry stopped. He pressed a hand to his chest, his face tightening in pain. "Max," he whispered, before collapsing onto the soft grass. Max barked frantically, circling Henry, nudging him with his nose. But his owner did not move. The next hours were a blur, voices, flashing lights, strangers carrying Henry away. Max tried to follow, but the doors of the ambulance closed, leaving him behind. Henry never came home. At the funeral, Max sat quietly by the casket, his head resting on his paws. He didn't understand why everyone was crying, why they lowered Henry into the ground and covered him with dirt. And when it was all over, when the last mourner had left, Max stayed. He refused to leave the gravesite. Days passed, then weeks. The townspeople noticed the lone dog who never moved from the old man's grave. Some pitied him, bringing him scraps of food and bowls of water. An elderly woman named Martha often came by, her heart aching at the sight of Max's grief. "You poor thing," she whispered one evening, setting down a warm blanket beside him. "You miss him, don't you?" Max barely glanced at her. His once bright eyes were dull, his ears drooping, his body weak from hunger and exhaustion. But he did not leave. The nights were cold, rain soaked his fur, the wind howled through the trees. The first frost of winter dusted the cemetery. And still, Max remained. He would not abandon Henry. He waited for something, anything. Then, one fateful night, as he lay shivering beside the grave, his breathing shallow, his body too weak to move, he heard something, a sound that made his ears twitch. His heart pound, a voice, soft, familiar, warm. Max, his eyes flew open, his head lifted, his ears perked. Could it be? The train rolled into the small town of Willowbrook just as the last light of the evening faded into the horizon. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the familiar sights of home stirred something deep in Emily Walker's chest. But as she stepped onto the platform, the weight of grief settled over her like a heavy coat. She was home, but nothing felt the same. Emily had spent the last several months overseas, caught up in the demands of her job. She had always meant to return sooner, to visit her father, Henry Walker, and spend time in the house where she had grown up. But life had a way of slipping through her fingers. When the news of her father's passing reached her, she had been thousands of miles away, unable to get back in time for the funeral. Now, she was here, but it was too late. The taxi ride from the station to her childhood home was quiet. The driver, an old man who must have known her father, gave her a sympathetic glance through the rearview mirror but said nothing. Willowbrook was a small town. Everyone knew everyone's business, and everyone knew about Henry Walker and his loyal dog, Max. Emily had heard the stories before she even stepped foot in town. Max, the golden retriever her father had raised from a puppy, had refused to leave Henry's grave. The neighbors had tried to coax him away, offering him food and warmth, but he had stayed at the cemetery, waiting. As the taxi pulled up to the house, she hesitated before stepping out. The place looked the same, the wooden porch, the flower beds now overgrown with weeds, the rocking chair where her father used to sit with a book in his hands and Max curled up beside him. But the house felt empty. Emily pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The scent of old books and lavender lingered in the air, mixed with something else, dust, abandonment. She turned on a few lights, their glow casting long shadows on the wooden floors. She walked slowly through the house, running her fingers over the furniture, the shelves filled with books, the small kitchen where her father used to make tea in the evenings. Every room was filled with memories. She could almost hear his voice, deep and steady, telling her about his latest gardening project or reading poetry aloud just because he enjoyed the way the words sounded. Then, she realized something. The house was too quiet. She turned, looking toward the doorway where, for years, Max had always greeted her whenever she came home. But Max wasn't there. Her heart dropped. She had assumed, hoped, that despite everything, Max would have found his way back home, that she would open the door to find him lying by the fireplace, waiting for her return. But the house was empty. Panic bubbled in her chest as she stepped back onto the porch. "Max?" she called into the night. Only the wind answered. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, her exhaustion forgotten. She couldn't rest, not until she found him. Emily searched the property first, calling Max's name as she walked around the garden, past the old tool shed, and down the narrow dirt path that led to the fields where her father used to take Max for walks. But there was no sign of him. She checked with the neighbors the next morning. Martha, the kind elderly woman who lived next door, shook her head with a sad smile. "Oh, sweetheart, I wish I had good news," she said. "We've all been trying to help him. But that poor dog, he just wouldn't leave Henry's grave. He stayed there for days. But when we last checked, he was gone." Emily frowned. "Gone?" Martha sighed. "Yes, dear. A few days ago, someone went to bring him food. But he wasn't there anymore. No one knows where he went. Emily's chest tightened. She spent the rest of the day searching. She walked through the town, checking every alleyway, every familiar place where Max might have gone. She asked the butcher, the baker, and even the postman if they had seen him. Nothing. By the time evening fell, exhaustion crept into her bones. She returned home, sinking into the old couch, pressing a hand to her forehead. Where was he? Then, a thought struck her. The cemetery. She had been so focused on searching the town that she hadn't gone back to the place where it had all started. Her father's grave. Her stomach twisted. What if Max had returned there? Without another moment of hesitation, she grabbed her coat and flashlight again and headed into the night. The cemetery was silent except for the whisper of the wind through the trees. The iron gates creaked softly as Emily pushed them open, stepping onto the worn stone path. She moved carefully, her breath visible in the cold air. Her flashlight flickered as she shone it over the rows of graves. Searching. Then, she saw him, curled up beside the freshly turned earth, his golden fur damp from the evening mist. Was Max. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Max. The dog didn't stir at first. She took slow steps toward him, heart hammering. As she drew closer, she saw how frail he looked, his ribs slightly visible beneath his fur. His eyes tired and dull. He had stayed here, waiting, refusing to leave. Her throat tightened as she crouched beside him. Max, she whispered again, reaching out with a trembling hand. His ears twitched. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes met hers. For a moment, there was silence. Then, recognition. A soft, weak whimper escaped his throat as he pushed himself up, staggering slightly before pressing his face into her lap. Emily let out a shaky breath, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Oh, Max," she murmured, running her fingers through his dirty fur. "I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner." Max nuzzled against her, his body warm despite the chill in the air. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "I know you miss him," she whispered. "I miss him too." They sat there for a long time, the cemetery silent around them. But for the first time in weeks, neither of them was alone. Emily knew she couldn't change the past. She couldn't bring her father back or erase the pain of losing him. But she could do this. She could bring Max home. She could make sure he never felt abandoned again. With gentle hands, she lifted the tired golden retriever into her arms. He let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing as if, finally, he knew he was safe. Emily stood, glancing one last time at her father's grave. "We'll take care of each other," she promised, then turned and walked out of the cemetery. Max nestled against her chest, and as they disappeared into the night, a soft wind rustled through the trees, as if Henry himself was watching, smiling, knowing that his two most loyal companions had finally found their way back home. Emily carried Max in her arms as she walked home from the cemetery, her heart both heavy and relieved. The golden retriever lay limp against her chest, too exhausted to move, but as she held him close, she felt his warmth, the faint rise and fall of his breathing. He was weak, but he was alive. She pressed her cheek against his fur. "You're coming home, Max," she whispered. "I promise." The town of Willowbrook was silent at this late hour. The streets empty, the houses dark. As she walked past familiar places, the bakery, the bookstore, the old oak tree where she and her father used to sit, memories flickered in her mind like candlelight. She thought of her father's laughter, the way he used to ruffle Max's fur and call him a good old boy. She thought of their quiet evenings on the porch, the warmth of home that had once been so constant, so reliable. But things were different now. Her father was gone, and for the first time, Emily realized that she wasn't just grieving his death, she was grieving all the time she had lost with him. The regret weighed heavily on her chest. But as she glanced down at Max, she knew that she still had one last piece of her father left. And she wasn't going to lose him, too. By the time Emily reached the house, Max was barely awake. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and stepped inside, the warmth of the home wrapping around them like a soft embrace. She carefully placed Max on the couch, kneeling beside him. His fur was dirty and matted, his paws raw from days, weeks, of sleeping outside. "You poor thing," she murmured. She fetched a bowl of warm water and a soft cloth, gently wiping away the dirt from his golden fur. Max let out a tired sigh. his eyes drooping as she worked. Then, she brought him a small bowl of food. At first, he only sniffed it, as if unsure, but after a few moments, he took slow, careful bites. Emily smiled, watching him eat. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She sat beside him, stroking his fur, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel so alone. Emily woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then, she felt the warmth beside her. She opened her eyes to find Max curled up next to her on the couch, his head resting on her lap. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and steady. A soft smile touched her lips. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the familiar weight of him beside her. "You're home now," she whispered. "And I'm home, too." Max stirred, his tail giving a slow, lazy wag, and in that moment, Emily knew that, somehow, they were going to be okay. In the days that followed, Max slowly regained his strength. Emily took him on gentle walks through the fields her father had once loved, letting him feel the sun on his fur again. She bathed him, brushed out his tangled coat, and made sure he had warm meals every day. But more than that, she gave him love. And in return, Max gave it back. Everywhere she went, he was by her side, just as he had always been for her father. It was as if Henry had left behind a part of himself in Max. And through Max, Emily found herself reconnecting with the father she had lost. She spent hours in the garden, tending to the lavender and rosemary, just as Henry had. She read his old books, sat on the porch in the evenings, and let the memories of him settle into the corners of the house like old, familiar friends. And slowly, the grief that had once felt unbearable became something softer. It became love. Love for her father. Love for Max. Love for the home she had once left behind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily and Max walked back to the cemetery. This time, she wasn't searching, she was visiting. She knelt beside her father's grave, Max sitting quietly beside her. For a long moment, she simply stared at the name etched into the stone. Henry Walker. A good man, a kind man, a father who had loved her, even when she had been too far away to see it. She reached out and placed a small bundle of fresh lavender on the grave. Then, she smiled. "Don't worry, Dad," she said softly. "Max is home now, and so am I." The wind rustled gently through the trees. As if answering her, Max pressed his head against her shoulder. And together, they sat in the quiet of the evening, two souls who had once been lost, now found. And in that moment, Emily knew, this was not the end. This was the beginning.
What do you think about today's story? Do you believe situations like this can happen in real life? If you have any thoughts or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any exciting stories. See you in the next video.